Good morning, everybody, or good morning as the room starts filling up. Welcome to our Wednesday talk. As usual, we will give a couple of minutes just to let the room fill up, and it's always lovely to greet and see where everybody is joining us from. In the chat box, you can just pop us, where you're joining us from, and we can greet some of our regulars and see some new people, hopefully from various parts of the world. As the room starts filling up nicely, we just give a couple of minutes. Good morning, Justine up in Thunderbell Park. Obviously, Belinda again on the background, keeping everything running smoothly for us. Thank you. Leslie, just around the corner here in Century City. Nice to see you. Morning, everybody. As I say, we're just giving a couple of minutes for the room to fill up. Oh, Diane, down on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. Welcome. Hello, Gritty up in Pretoria. Nice to see you. Sunshine Coast, Australia. What, that's pushing 9 o'clock tonight. Thank you for joining us. Nina in Pretoria. And Louise in Centurion now, but used to actually live in Tanzania. So some local knowledge there. Ray, out in New Zealand. Sure. People joining us from all over the world. Fantastic to see. David, and he's got 7 of his students from Arusha in Tanzania. Thank you for joining us, David. Hello, everybody. Eric up in Poch. Right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday talk, brought to you by Room to Grow, Sandby, and Straight Nature. Before we start, just a couple of mentions of our sponsors. Thank you to Straight Nature. So Straight Nature is the leading specialist natural history publisher in Southern Africa, associated with the best-selling and most highly regarded field guides in the region. Straight Nature publishes full-color illustrated books across a variety of subjects, including birds, mammals, reptiles, trees, and flowers, as well as the marine environment, geology, astronomy, general wildlife, and of course, the ever-popular children's nature. And then Room to Grow. My name is Brett. I'm the owner of Room to Grow. We're an exterior design and project management company that's been designing and creating indoor and outdoor living spaces in and around Cape Town since 2002. And we offer a complete suite of landscape design, construction, and maintenance to our residential and commercial and retail clients. And then it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Roger Scoon. Roger completed his PhD at Rhodes University, where his research sparked a lifetime focus on the platinum and chromite deposits of the Bushveld complex. His career spans roles in mining and exploration geologist, as well as the project management for feasibility studies, as well as a leader for international field excursions, including the International Geological Congress in 2016 and the Geological Society of South Africa in 2024. As a director of Platexco Inc., he oversaw the sale of the key platinum resources that led to the establishment of the Marula platinum mine. And Roger has published extensively on geology. Before we start, just to remind everybody that questions will be taken at the end. There's the Q&A box. You can put your questions in there during the talk, and we'll get them to Roger afterwards. Thank you for joining us, Roger. So looking forward to this talk. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brett. Very nice introduction. And as you heard from Brett, my particular speciality is really in the platinum and chromite deposits in the Bushveld complex. But here we're talking on a sort of more recent interest of mine, which I started around 2000, which is geoheritage, particularly geoheritage of East Africa, which led to publication of a book with Straight Nature, which is where Belinda comes in. And the talk is essentially segments of the book, which I've taken out especially for the talk. The book covers 3 or 4 countries, but here we're going to focus particularly on northern Tanzania. So the area in question is, well, the red arrows it's really about 8 locations listed on the top right of the slide. The Arusha National Park, Lake Manyara, Lake Natron, Kilimanjaro, and Ngorongoro, Serengeti, Tarangire. But it's quite interesting to note that the Tanzania National Parks Authority, they have 22 national parks and a lot of reserves. This is an old map. My map in the book was a little bit too complicated for a slide. This is quite an old map from the internet. And many of these areas over here labeled as reserves, they're now national parks. And I think Tanzania as a country has done the most fantastic job of creating parks and protecting these areas. And I think we all know that the national parks and reserves in East Africa are so famous for the wildlife. Just a couple of photographs here. The elephant on the top right, by the way, is one of my photographs. That's from Tarangire, which is a very scenic park, which is not always put on the people's itineraries. But I think from my point of view, I believe that the area could become as equally famous for geotourism. And geotourism is a relatively new concept in our part of the world, but there are geoparks dotted all around the world now. And you can go, for example, on volcano safaris in Italy and many other areas, of course. So geotourism, I think, is going to become more and more important. And I think from a point of view of East Africa, particularly Tanzania, it would actually give the opportunity to have higher levels of tourism rather than just the wildlife safaris, sitting in the vehicles. People could go on organized hikes with armed rangers. You can have more specialized guides, so like guides could, probably charge higher fees. And I think it could be a win-win for the country and, and for the world in general to come and see these spectacular sites. So the most famous topography and geological feature in the country is, of course, the Rift Valley. This is the escarpment of one of the Rift Valleys, because there are multiple valleys near Lake Natron. And you can see these horizontal layers in the escarpment face. That's intercalated layers of volcanic ash and lava. So that the face that you're looking at is made entirely of volcanic material. And then the floor of the Rift Valley has got this braided stream pattern at the base of the valley, which is typical of a new land surface, because the surfaces are either dropping or being infilled with material all the time. So it's a very active environment. And possibly the most important single concept to get across in a talk such as this is that the rifting that makes the processes that makes the valleys is also related to volcanoes. So the rifting and volcanicity goes together. This is Ordoña Lengai, one of the most active volcanoes in East Africa. It's in Tanzania, near Lake Natron. But when it erupts every couple of years, and the seismic events can be felt as far as Nairobi. So some people tend to get confused and think it might be in Kenya, but it's not. It's in Tanzania. We'll be looking at later on in more detail. Just this is a digital terrain image. Note the scale bar of about 100 kilometers to give you some idea of the area. And the parks that we're going to visit in the areas, we're going to start in the east and sort of work west. This is Mount Kilimanjaro, and you can just see just by the scale bar how enormous these mountains actually are. And just about every peak on this image would be a volcano. So to give you some, there are a lot of volcanoes in these areas, many extinct, of course, but they are volcanic in origin. The second park we'll visit is the Arusha National Park with Mount Meru, and then you see all of these features here. These are all separate volcanoes, and in the Rift Valley, which is designated between these dashed lines, that this will be the Tanzanian branch of the Rift Valley. Each of these big mountains are rifts. Then, of course, as we go further across, we're going to go to Tarangire, Lake Manyara, and Ngorongoro. There's the famous caldera, which is just part of the Ngorongoro feature. And then we're going to go further west to the Serengeti, and then duck east a bit for the logic you'll see as the talk develops to Lake Natron, number 7, and then lastly to back west to Olduvai Gorge, the anthropological site. So as I said, the most prominent geological feature of the region is the rifting, the East African rift system. So geologists, we're fascinated by processes which make the surface topography that we actually see. So we prefer to call it a rift system rather than just the East African rift. And the logic being is that it's because it's related to all of this volcanic activity as well. So there's three really main branches: the Ethiopian branch here, the western branch, which geologists refer to as the Albertine Rift. Lake Albert is there in Uganda on the Uganda-Congo border. And then the Gregory Rift would be the Eastern Rift, which comes down through Kenya. And then it peters out here in northern Tanzania, which is the area that we're actually going to look at in this talk. And then it is connected to the Pangani Rift as well. And there's also subsidiary rifts. There's quite a prominent rift structure coming up here as well. And then the rift dashes across towards Lake Malawi. So it's possibly much more complicated than people realize. And the volcanic activity has resulted in these huge areas of high land, the brown on the satellite image being higher land, the green over here, the lower land and forest in the Congo Central African rainforest. So we refer to these areas as a Kenyan Tanzanian dome and an Ethiopian dome. And they are some of the most active areas of volcanic activity on the planet. So we look at a sort of a geological map. We isolate the African plate. The plate boundaries would be between the Atlantic ridge, ocean ridge on the west, and the Indian Ocean ridge on the east. And essentially, the African plate is splitting because of the rifting. So rifting is simply one of the geological processes which are part of the whole continental drift hypothesis. And if the rifting continued, we'd end up with isolating what we geologists call a Nubian plate, which would be the main bit of Africa, and then a Somalian microplate would be this east bit. And the Somalian microplate would be defined by the plate boundaries, something like this. And of course, in between, we'd open up a new ocean. This is for the future. Of course, maybe the rifting will actually stop or terminate, we don't know. But the key is to note that the rifting is active, it's an active geological system, and it's ongoing. And the evidence on this image is one of the key supporters of the whole hypothesis of continental drift, for the simple reason that the volcanoes shown with the red triangles and the seismic events, they all line up in the same areas. So they're here on the rift valleys in East Africa. The Red Sea is an extension of the East African rift, which then goes up this fault boundary here, and that's where these very catastrophic earthquakes were in Turkey a couple of years ago. They're actually on that fault. And then at the same time, the African plate is pushing north into Europe, and that's creating all of the seismic activity and the volcanoes along these boundary areas here, including Vesuvius and the Italian volcanoes, all essentially related to the same overall geological phenomena. And geological maps are always a bit scary in these sort of talks because there's usually too much detail. But the concept here is to get the message across. This is the area that we're looking at, which is part of this northern Tanzania divergence. So the rift-related rocks are shown in the green. So the shiny green, that's the volcanic rocks in the Rift Valley. But there's also lots of volcanic rocks on the rift shoulders, particularly in Kenya, shown in the lighter green here. And then, of course, the purples and this sort of purple color and the pink, these are part of the basement complexes, which are shown in the legend on the bottom right. And this would correspond to the Serengeti. So we're really only looking at two broad geological rock types in this talk. We're looking at the ancient rocks which underlie the plateaus in the Serengeti, and then we're looking at the volcanic rocks as part of this whole rifted terrain. And just a few names to help people with all of these sort of different geological terminology. Is the rifting started at around 35 million years ago. It's in what we call the Cenozoic period. It used to be called the Tertiary. It's a bit of an old name, but it's essentially Cenozoic. And as I said, it's still active. But the main period of rifting and volcanic activity was in the Oligocene period epoch, which is shown here. The Miocene epoch, which is a very important part of the history between 23 and 5 million years ago, because that's when primates evolved and a lot of the mammals that we see in Africa today. Then the Pliocene, which is between 5 and 1.8 million, that's when hominins evolved on the planet. Then the Pleistocene, most famous, I guess, for the ice ages, which are in the upper Pleistocene around a million years, between a million years and 15,000 years ago. And then the period the epoch that we live in at the moment, the Holocene, that's 11,700. And then we change from millions of years to BP, before present. And I've just pushed again this idea that the rifting is not just the valleys with the alkaline lakes. You've got elevated rift shoulders, which you saw in that previous image. And then there's also all the volcanic activity, which includes giant freestanding volcanic cones and complexes, all interrelated from a geological point of view. So if we were to look at the two main landforms in East Africa, we have top left the regional plateau, where some of the ancient rocks stick up to make either kopjes or Inselbergs. And Inselberg is a German word for an island mountain. That picture's in northern Kenya. It's the best example I've got of how the regional plateau looks, other than the Serengeti, which we'll be looking at later on. The Rift Valley, well, you guys know all about that. And this is, again, a part of the rift in northern Kenya. And again, the striping in the rock face, the same as the previous one, would be mostly volcanic lavas and ashes. And then the picture on the bottom right, just clusters of volcanic cones in Kenya. And sorry for that. And landforms, of course, are categorized and interpreted in terms of both geological processes and geological ages. And this is possibly the bit where geology is very different to learning some of these areas in school through geography, is that we're interested very much in the processes, how the rocks actually form, how these landforms actually develop. And just a little bit of homework. Really, this is the sort of slide that one might like to read at your leisure later on. But as I said now several times, the rifting and the volcanism is interrelated. And the process is probably driven by a mantle plume. And a plume is really a deep-seated feature in the Earth, where a hot, buoyant rock rises from inside in the interior of the Earth to make crustal magma chambers and volcanoes. And the magma compositions reflect a combination of the melting of the mantle and of the continental crust. So you can get a huge range of compositions. And although it doesn't really say here, the compositions can affect the style of volcanic activity. So, for example, the volcanic activity of Mount Kenya, which is an extinct volcano, and Mount Meru would be in a completely different, even though they're in the same area. And as a general feature, the magmas of the East African rift system are very rich in alkalis, sodium and potassium. This tends to result in a lot of very catastrophic volcanic eruptions with a lot of volcanic ash. And as we said before, but just to repeat, the volcanic activity occurs in the valleys and on the shoulders. And we can divide the volcanic activity into, we have plateau-style outpourings. They're often what makes up these high plateaus. The Aberdare Mountains in Kenya would be an example of that. And then we have volcanic complexes, and we also have giant stratovolcanoes, a new word maybe for many of you. And the stratovolcanoes are important because many of the volcanoes in East Africa fit into that category. We'll have a look at it in a moment. And when we try to unravel this relationship between the rifting and the volcanic activity, we find that the volcanoes may be formed first. In fact, it's relatively clear evidence now that the doming is related to magma coming up from the mantle plume from deep inside the Earth's interior. You can have separate magma chambers, and then they push up to make volcanoes, and then you get some early stage faulting. But the rifting hasn't actually started yet. So the volcanic activity probably starts first, and we can actually categorize the volcanoes in the East African rift system into pre-rift and rift related. And the best example of the pre-rift volcanoes is actually Mount Elgon on the border of Uganda and Kenya. It's 22 million years old, if I recall correctly, one of the older volcanoes. So when the main rift stage happens, then we start to get a rift valley, a well-developed valley. This is simply because of the stretching of the crust. So the crust is stretching and thinning, and that it instigates faults, which makes these linear valleys. Some of the escarpments can be traced for 20 or 30 kilometers. And as we said, you have these high platforms on the side, some of which would be, the green color would be the volcanic material related to the rifting, and then the brown or beige color would be these ancient basement rocks, which have also been uplifted on the side of the platform on these rift shoulders. And the strange thing is, it's not that easy a concept to grasp, is that as the rift valleys drop, the shoulders actually go up, and so that the rift drops, but the shoulder doesn't stay in the same position, it actually rises. And the best example of that is taking some bread, a sort of unsliced loaf of bread, pushing down in the middle, and you'll find that the sides come up. And that's because of the elasticity of the crust. And the average height of the plateau in East Africa is around 1,200 to 1,800 meters. But parts of the rift shoulders, particularly in Kenya, this is just a schematic diagram, but if this was one of the rift shoulders in Kenya, for example, Eldoret, where all the famous long distance, or many of the famous long distance runners come from, the shoulders there are over 3,000 meters high. So the shoulders have pushed up very high. And then, of course, we have the volcanic activity. There's now shallow crustal chambers. So the volcanoes can erupt sort of rapidly from near surface magma ponded just below. And then we get these big giant stratovolcanoes, of which the best example is Mount Meru. We're going to be looking at on the side of the rift. So this is really what categorizes a stratovolcano. They consist of alternating layers of ash and lava, and they're associated with extensive ash columns, which may go as high as 800 kilometers. They have pyroclastic flows, these things which rush down the side of the mountain at speeds of over 200 kilometers an hour. And they're known as Plinian eruptions, after Pliny the Younger documented the AD 79 eruption of Vesuvius in Italy, of course. And they can also lead to caldera events, which is another key part of the talk, because one of the most famous calderas in the world is Ngorongoro, which is shown here. And one of the messages to get across is, please don't call it a crater, despite many of the famous documentaries on the BBC and the National Geographic calling it a crater. Is not a crater. A crater is a relatively small feature where lava and ash is erupted from. A caldera is really entirely different. It's a tectonic feature, a structural feature, where the mountain, the volcano originally would have had slopes like this, and then the whole mountain has collapsed down into the magma chamber. The magma chamber shown in red here, and it's a collapse, right down into the chamber. So Ngorongoro could possibly have been as high as Everest prior to the caldera collapse. And Ngorongoro is one of the largest and best preserved calderas on Earth. It's got a diameter of 20 kilometers. We'll have a look at that in a moment. So this whole story of how stratovolcanoes can actually collapse to make calderas is a key part of the talk. So now what we'll do is we'll start off by looking at some of the areas. We've got a little bit of background. We'll start off with Kilimanjaro and then move to Mount Meru. And as you know, Kilimanjaro is one of the most famous mountains in Africa, possibly in the world, and it's a volcanic cone. I imagine everybody knows that. But the key is that the main peak, which everybody think is that is Kilimanjaro. Well, it's not, because the main peak is just one mountain, one volcano. The main peak is the volcano called Kibo, and then there's an extinct volcano called Shira on this is a view looking south from Kenya. So this would be on the west side. So Shira is an extinct volcano dated at 2 million. And then the subsidiary peak, which you see quite clearly if any of you have been to Kili, is Mwenzi. That's also extinct, 1 million year old. But Kibo, geologists, we categorize as a dormant volcano. The eruption, the oldest activity started around 350,000 and the most recent 100,000. But there are verbal reports from the Maasai of eruptions only a few thousand years ago, and there's geothermal heat in the crater, so we actually consider it to be a dormant volcano. Sorry, and so Kilimanjaro is not a single volcano; it's a volcanic edifice of these three centers, which have been active over 2 million years. And as a little note above, the lava flows extend onto the regional plateau, including northward into Kenya. So not all of the geological features are in Tanzania. If we look at a Google Earth image, we can see what possibly the most famous feature of these big East African mountains is that you have these annular ecosystems which are just purely dictated by altitude. So when you hike up, you start on the volcanic plateau, which is often open savanna. You go through these Afro-montane forests, a unique botanical zone with these, fantastic, huge podocarpus forest on the slopes. And then you go up into the heathland and the moorland, up to the summit plateau and alpine desert with ice fields. And there's the crater, the Roche crater up on the summit, which is, as I said, it's got geothermal heat. There's a photograph showing the Kibo and then the subsidiary peak of Mwenzi, that 1 million year old extinct volcano in the background. This view is looking east. And the key is actually that Kibo is a collapsed caldera. It doesn't look like it, but it is. And the caldera faults would have been what would line up where I'll put these red bars on the side of the picture. And so the highest peak, Uhuru Peak, is actually located on the rim of the caldera. So prior to the caldera collapse, Kibo would have been considerably higher, and I think there are estimates that would put it at, rather than 5,100 odd meters or 200 meters, whatever it is now, would be possibly have been over 7,000 meters high. This is just a little view of the summit plateau. There's the Roche crater, and the Graben, the caldera fault rather has been mapped in this sort of circular pattern. And that brings me to an important point, that an awful lot, probably 99% of what I'm showing and explaining here is based on geological maps, many of which were done by the old British Geological Survey in the colonial days, but there are lots of newer maps that the East African countries have done as well, and there's hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers. So there's a lot of detailed information to pass across. And if you're interested in the ice fields part of the talk, it shouldn't just be volcanoes. The modern geology is also very important. You have a northern ice field, and then which is a static ice field, and then these are sloped glaciers. And this difference being that the sloped glacier is moving and the ice fields are static. And this is the FW labels the Furtwängler Glacier, which is on the plateau, also a static ice sheet. And if you have walked up there, hiked up, you go up the Marango route, or that's the way I went as well, the most popular route, and you would come up to the caldera rim somewhere here, and then you hike around. I should have labeled the peak, it's somewhere over there. So you actually have to hike around the rim to get to the top. So there's a couple of pictures that I managed to, a volcanologist, glaciologist, American glaciologist, shared with me that he'd taken in doing research in 2017. So the northern icefield is still a substantial feature, but the Furtwängler Glacier is disappearing at an alarming rate. And the little picture here shows you what the icefield was like in 1912. And then in 2011, and it's probably shrunk a little bit less, with quite a nice historical photograph of the extensiveness of the ice sheets, the glaciers, and a fair bit of snow in 1938. So the ice has been shrinking long before global warming became a popular concept. Let's just put it like that. So if we now nip across to the Arusha National Park, where the main feature is Mount Meru. This is really a vegetation map, and it's showing the extent of the Afro-montane forests, which would correlate essentially with the slopes of the volcano, and then you have a caldera, which is grassy, close to the summit of the mountain, and then this summit ridge where it's unvegetated rocky slopes. And the key feature of Meru is that you have a horseshoe-shaped caldera, which is open to the east. So, and there's a subsidiary volcano called Ngurdutu over here, which is very, very scenic. And then you have these Mamela lakes, which are quite a key part of any visit to the national park, which shown in an inset because they're a bit small. So if we looked at a Google image, you can see the caldera now quite clearly. This will be the caldera faults and a circular structure. There's the Socialist Peak, 4565 meters. And then in the middle of the caldera, there's an ash cone, and the caldera is open to the east, as I said before. And the dark green shows you how extensive the forests are here. This is a picture of my wife, Amelia, who's one of my great supporters of my work. We're coming off the top of Socialist Peak. We went about 15 years ago now. And as you can see, it's the most fantastic climb, possibly much nicer in a way than Kilimanjaro, because first of all, there's very few people, and you're on these rocky slopes for the last 4 or 5 hours. And the climb up the summit, up this summit dome, just to get to the very peak is really quite tough. And you can see that this is where the evidence that it's a stratovolcano, you can see the striations in the rock, is the deposits of volcanic ash and lava. And this is a view from the peak, looking east, and you can see Little Meru, which is quite a nice little subsidiary climb that we did it as on the day before, just like a little warm-up, a subsidiary peak. You're looking over the caldera. Now you get the idea of this horseshoe-shaped caldera. This is the ash cone in the middle of the caldera. And these cliffs, by the way, are possibly as much as 2,500 meters. They're probably some of the highest, probably unclimbed cliffs left on Earth. And in the background, you can actually see the gentle outer slopes of Kilimanjaro. So it's quite a nice view looking east. Kilimanjaro is about 40 kilometers away. That's a view of the ash cone in the middle of the caldera. And this is very, very typical of a caldera, that you have rejuvenation of the volcanic activity in the caldera. The caldera formed around 8,000 BP, which is quite a key event for the global warming people, because there was a key change, a particularly dry period at that time. And I'm not sure that people have linked the possibility of a world climate change being related to the eruption of Meru, which is a possibility. And the most recent activity in the ash cone occurred in 1910. So you can see why Meru is gazetted as an active volcano. And it's potentially very dangerous for the people in Arusha, because it's subjected to these catastrophic eruptions, these big caldera events. Just a couple of pictures. It's just the most superb place to study volcanology, especially on the upper slopes where the rocks are not are exposed nicely, and it's also got these fantastic forests. And as a tip, if any of you want to go and climb it, we made sure we booked an extra couple of days to hike through the forests. The bird life, turicos, et cetera, et cetera, is just fantastic in these forests, which are very much unspoiled. And one of the geological features of calderas is that they make what we call debris avalanche deposits, which we call DADs, nice abbreviation. And the big debris avalanche deposit at Meru, there are actually multiple ones, but to keep it simple, I'm just showing one. It's called the Mermella deposit because of the Mermella lakes. And this is related to the breaching of the Caldera War, which, as we said, happened 8,000 years ago. And as the war collapses, all of the volcanic material in the side of the mountain collapses, and it makes a big avalanche which shunts off sideways. And the Mermella avalanche actually went as far as Kilimanjaro. So this is a view to try to show that, looking down the side of the mountain, looking east, there's the Mermella Lakes in the foreground, and the avalanche deposit makes this typical hummocky grounds. It's very easy to see because you end up with sort of huge blocks of rock, which would be the size of a sort of giant building in a big inner city, a skyscraper type building with little pebbles around it as well. And the avalanche only came to rest 40 kilometers away when it started going up the slopes of Kilimanjaro. Quite a remarkable feature. It may well be the biggest debris avalanche deposit on Earth, but it's hard to know the size of all of the other features which have been mapped. And just an extra piece of information, the Mermella Lakes, they have alkaline and fresh water. They're fed by springs, which from the mountain. And so you can get flamingo, which we were lucky enough to see once. They sort of line the shores. And a lot of the migratory birds between Southern Africa and Europe stop here. It's quite a superb birding spot. If we go across now a little bit more west, and slightly south, we go to Tarangire. Just a couple of pictures here, because there's not a lot of geology to see. But what it does do, it gives you a different feel again of some different geological processes. The dominant feature being the Tarangire River, which flows north towards Lake Manyara. It doesn't reach Manyara, but it stops in a small lake quite close in the rift. But these are the open plains. This is part of the regional plateau. So a lot of the areas underlain by ancient rocks, which are as much as 2.5 billion years old, and the rivers are subjected to flooding, and that's what drives the fantastic scenery in the park. So you can go and see the big herds of elephant and buffalo with the dome palms, etc., etc. And there's again phenomenal bird life. I think this is mostly Abdim stork and a few egrets and what have you, a typical sort of wetlands view in Tarangire. And of course, in the dry season, it can look pretty desperate, but after the floods, it turns into these verdant paradise. And I've got quite a nice description of it, I think, in the book about how the flooding affects it. So now we move a little bit more west again. We'll start with Lake Manyara. We'll look at a picture of of the escarpment here, and then we go into Ngorongoro and the Serengeti. So a satellite image of the region, just a slightly closer up. Here's Lake Manyara, which is in the Rift Valley. So Lake Natron, which we're going to visit later here. So the Rift Valley comes down like this, but there's a subsidiary rift in between these two faults. And the main feature of that is the Ngorongoro Highlands. Again, a lot of forest. That's why the dark green. So this is the Ngorongoro Highlands. And the NCA is the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. It's not a national park because the Maasai, it's a traditional Maasai area. So they graze their cattle. And there's villages, etc., etc. And the Serengeti is off to the west, further off to the west. So it's a picture of Lake Manyara up on the top left. It's a shallow, typical shallow alkaline or soda lake in the rift, that only a few meters deep. It's surrounded by these extensive, mud and salt flats, and you get some grassy savanna. So there's quite big herds of wildlife, and then you even get a little fringe of forest at the bottom of the escarpment, I guess fed by water to some extent coming out from the highlands. So the photograph, of course, we're standing in the Ngorongoro Highlands looking down, and again you see these striations in the cliff because of the alternating layers of lavas and ash that have made up the escarpment. And if we go into the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, the geological map here shows you that the shiny green is showing the Ngorongoro volcanic complex, which is actually a complex of 8 coalesced volcanoes. So Ngorongoro, the caldera here, is just one of the volcanoes. There's five cones shown in little red triangles, and then 3 calderas. There's Ngorongoro, Olmoti, and Embagai. And then the purple and the pink are these ancient basement rocks, which you see as you go further up into the Serengeti over here. And the light green, that's volcanic ash, which covers all of this area here. And that comes from this volcano Olduvai Gorge that we started off with one of the pictures, which is why we're going to end there as well. And that covers a lot of these areas. So the Ngorongoro highlands correlate almost exactly with the volcanic complex. It's a big area, 90 kilometers by 80 kilometers. And as we said, there's 8 volcanoes. They're extinct. The volcanism was between 3.8 and 1.1 million. So in geological terms, relatively recent, but it is extinct. And as we said, there's 5 cones and 3 calderas. So Ngorongoro is simply the most famous of the features. It's not the only feature in the complex. And in Ngorongoro, that's the age is 2.8 to 1.8 million, and the caldera formed at 2 million. And you hear some quite different ages on some of the documentary programs where they haven't researched it properly. And if you're wondering how we get these ages or how I can be so confident that this age is correct, well, it's been researched by people from particularly this area, from a lady in America and a chap in Germany, and I think France as well. And they've done very, very detailed isotopic, age dating using these radiometric techniques to get the ages pretty much exact. And of course, the great thing about the caldera is a self-contained sanctuary, and it's not just got one ecosystem in the base of the caldera. It's got grassy savannas, forests, lakes, streams, swamps, and alkaline and fresh water. And approximately 25,000 large mammals inhabit the caldera permanently. And if we look to the geological map, again, this is just me simplifying the government geological survey maps. The diameter of the caldera approximately 20 kilometers. It's got different rock types in the caldera floor because of modern processes, if we just put it like that. But you can see the volcanic rocks quite nicely in the caldera rim. And then these are little patches of other volcanic rocks where there's been a rejuvenation of activity inside the caldera. So this is the picture we saw before. And many of you would know it has been listed as one of the 7 wonders of the world. And this is Lake Magadi. That's the main lake in the caldera, which here, and that's alkaline lake. But the thing about it is that over here, there's actually freshwater springs and swamps. There's and these are fed to some extent by these streams coming in from the northeast. And I guess a key part of the Ngorongoro system, from many of you might have visited it, is that if you go in the dry season, it can look a bit desperate. And if you go in the wet season, it looks like this verdant paradise. It really is a remarkable area, of course. This is a picture of the freshwater springs in the caldera. That's the caldera wall behind the springs. And then behind that is the Olmoti volcano, which is a little bit younger than Ngorongoro and is less eroded, so it's slightly higher. But again, an absolute paradise. And you can see there's some nice exposures, I think possibly just behind where the photograph's taken from, of the volcanic lavas that you can walk and look at in the picnic spot. It's the place you can walk around. And this is one of the smaller calderas in Ngorongoro Highlands, Embagai, but it's extremely scenic. As you can see, you even get the sort of table mountain cloud effect coming over the caldera walls, and you get views from here, which you can see Kilimanjaro off to the east and possibly as far as Mount Kenya. And the lake here is, again, it's an alkaline lake. It actually occupies most of the floor, but because you've got thick forested slopes where, which are full of buffalo as usual, in all of these areas, you have to go on organized hikes. So the Serengeti, of course, is particularly famous for the large herds on the open plains. So the top photograph, this would show the typical open plains, which are underlain by, as I said, these ancient basement rocks. Some of the basement rocks are granite. They can make these little whaleback outcrops here, and they can also make kopjes. It's quite nice that they use the word kopje, which they've taken from the Afrikaans language or Dutch, because of the settlers that moved into some of these areas in the early part of the 1900s. And granites often have these strange boulders and things because of the spheroidal weathering. There's no layering in granites. So these are some of the oldest rocks in the world. So it's quite a contrast to be able to walk from rocks which are 2.5 billion years old to rocks which these modern rocks as part of the rift system. And I think, again, this is very well known, but you've got the migration of the herbivores and browsers on the plains, maybe more than 2 million. And it's also been described as one of the 10 wonders of the world. This is the wildebeest crossing one of the rivers. They actually cross many rivers. I think often on the documentaries, it appears that they're only crossing one river, but there's quite a lot of river crossings. We'll see on a map in a minute. I was lucky just once to be there, seeing the herds gathering ready for the migration in near Lake Natron. As you can see, very dry. The rains have only just come, and the migration is made up. It's not just the wildebeest. There's also birchall zebra. There's Thompson's gazelle, eland, and there can be topi as well. But the key, really, in some ways, is that the herbivores, they're almost always on the move. It's not a fixed thing where they migrate twice a year, as they often say. And of course, to understand the Serengeti system properly, you have to actually put in the Mara Plains, which are in Kenya. So this is part of the Masai Mara Reserve over the border in Kenya. And behind the plains is the Isuria Escarpment, for the simple reason that the Mara Plains are actually in the Rift Valley. They're not on the plateau. So there's a big geological change there. And the idea I have is that the migration is driven not just by rainfall patterns, which is the general accepted parameter, but also due to the search for localized ecosystems related to the rifting. There's a geological control on it, basically. And this is expressed in one of the maps from the book. And essentially, there's four vegetation or ecosystems. Most of the books on the Serengeti will say there's 3, but there's 4. And the reason for this is that the long grass plains in the Western Corridor, they cover the main area of the Serengeti. And that's all on the regional plateau. And then there's the short grass plains where the plateau sort of merges into this Ngorongoro area, and they've got a different geological makeup, because this is where that volcanic ash, which has come across from the Aldonia Lengai volcano shown here in the Rift Valley. So that ash is covering all of these plains. And then the fourth system, which tends to get left out, is the Masai Mara, because it's not an extension of the regional plateau. It's actually within this Isuria rift. And the green and the brown is trying to, well, the green is the park and the brown is just an extension where the game moves on to these Loyuta plains. This is part of the rift system. So when we go to the next picture, we see how the migration works on an annual basis. Lake Natron is here. It's actually just outside the park. So the herds generally start shifting around February, March. They migrate north. You can see they cross a lot of rivers. Whoopsie. They cross quite a lot of rivers on their way north. And what they're actually doing is they're heading. This is the Mara River, one of the more well-known rivers, and the Sound River on the border. They're crossing into these lava plains in the Masai Mara. So these are lava plains, which is related to a Miocene age eruption somewhere between probably around 15 to 12 million year old lavas, maybe as young as 5 million. And there's a different vegetation type. Lush volcanic soils produce these grassy plains, which is what the herbivores and the grazers are heading to. And then, of course, by the time the rains are finished and the grass is finishing, they start heading south, September, October, and then they head towards these short grass plains, which essentially correlates with this volcanic ash shown in the legend there, which has come across from Ordenya Lengai. And then the herds essentially congregate and spread from the Serengeti into the Ngorongoro area. And that's driven, by the short grass plains where you have nutrient-rich soils, which sustain their growth, even during the dry season. So you can see there's very much a geological control on the migration. And one of the key things is Ordenya Lengai is a relatively recent volcano, and the volcanic ash covers a probably mostly younger than 10,000 years. So some of the movements might be a lot more recent than generally accepted. So just to go back to the image again, we see the regional plateau would extend in this area here up to this fault line, and then you have what we call a half graben. A graben is a geological word for a rift valley. That's where the Ngorongoro highlands and the volcanoes are in that structure, and then the main rift valley further across. So we're now going to head across to Ordenya Lengai, and if you go on these trips and you want to add on extra visits, you can visit the Lake Natron area from this village here. The road as a long rough track goes up, but you can also, which is quite nice, go from Serengeti. You can travel around the north of the Gold Mountains and around on a road like this. It's quite a spectacular trip. So Lake Natron in the Rift Valley, it's a beautiful setting, and it's got it's an alkaline lake. It's only a couple of meters deep, but it's got freshwater springs in that southwest corner where you can see quite a lot of bird life, and the zebra and the giraffe actually come and drink there, which is quite strange before you realize that it's actually fresh water, and the two waters don't really mix. So this is a satellite image of Lake Natron showing the sort of bloom of the if I could get rid of it. Yeah. There's a toxic bloom, which is related to the high concentrations of cyanobacteria. And that's, of course, what the flamingo feed on. And the waters are so toxic, the pH can be greater than 12, that if you put your finger in the little pools where it concentrates, it would burn. It becomes like an acid. And the lake is fringed by salt flats, which are mostly made of sodium carbonates. This is where the high sodium concentration of the volcanic lavas and ash comes into the game. And Natron is essentially the main breeding ground of the flamingo in East Africa. It's got a remote location, and I think the cyanobacteria is slightly more concentrated than on some of the lakes further north. And one of the quite nice things to do there is you can do a hike with the Maasai guides up this Ngorongoro Gorge. It was one of the streams flowing off the Ngorongoro highlands. So here it's cutting into the escarpment. So we're looking at different volcanic rocks. These are two types of lava. This is what we call a breccia dike, where the magma's fed through piles of lava, a volcanic ash. This would be a gravel deposit related to the floods in the river, but this is actually a volcanic a debris avalanche deposit, a volcanic avalanche deposit. So you can see quite a lot of features there, and it's a spectacular walk. You can go up to some waterfalls where you can swim, and the Maasai guides are incredibly knowledgeable, even on the geology. It's quite amazing. Actually, it's a great experience. So if we look at Ordenya Lengai, this is the volcano here. It's a circular sort of feature, of course. There's another similar volcano, Kerimasi, just to the south. So that's Kerimasi. This is a view looking over the crater at the top of Ordenya Lengai, Lake Natron here. And this is the Rift Valley here. So they're just situated right at the foot of the rift. So the climb, it's not that high, but the climb's quite strenuous because you start in the Rift Valley. There's another volcano called Mosonic here, and then the volcanic ash shown in this green, which is, as we saw earlier, is spread off to the west. And one of the things about Olduvai Gorge, it's the only active volcano on Earth which erupts sodium-rich carbonate or carbonatite magmas. Most magmas, or 99.9% magmas, are silicates, basalts, rhyolites, whatever. But Lengai has these strange carbonate magmas. So and the two types of magmas are immiscible, and the eruptions can be alternating. So one time it can erupt a silicate magma, and the next time it can erupt a carbonatite magma. And in the old days, before one of them, a relatively big eruption, this photograph's 1995, but unfortunately eruptions 2011, 2012 destroyed the top of the mountain, so you can't visit the crater. This is us visiting the crater, a friend of mine on the trip from Rhodes, Clyde Mallinson, who's quite well known in the alternative energy space these days. We're on the outside of the crater there. This is inside the crater, and inside these conduits, you could hear the magma moving at depth. It's actually quite a scary sort of experience in a way. And then you've got these different lava flows, and this would be some form of conduit where the magma was moving just below the surface of the lava. And as you can see, the lavas are white, which is highly unusual for volcanic rocks. The magma, when it comes out, first of all, as a lava flow, is black, but it weathers within a couple of days to these grey colours, and that's a sign of the carbonates. It basically reacts with the atmosphere. And if we now sort of nip back west again towards the Serengeti, this is quite a nice geosite near Olduvai Gorge, which is the last bit of the talk. We see this sort of isolated sand dunes. They're Barken dunes with the horns, and which tells you the direction they're moving. And they're made of very coarse-grained, almost black volcanic ash, and it's from Olduvai Gorge. And the ash is held together because as the wind jostles the particles, you get a negative electric charge. And a process called saltation causes the ash to stick together, and the fine ash is all being blown away. And what's amazing is that the dunes are migrating west at the rate of approximately 17 meters a year, which is quite fast. And within the tracks of the dunes, which have been left behind, which would be off to the back of the Land Rovers that we went on this particular trip, the zoologists have actually found extinct dune beetles, and there's scientific papers on this. Fossil dune beetles, extinct species, which have been preserved underneath the ash. So if we looked on a geological map of the areas, it's quite a close-up map. This is a scale of 10 kilometers. This is Olduvai Gorge, the famous anthropological gorge. It's usually a dry river, and it's the only river on the Serengeti Plains that flows east. All the other rivers flow west towards Lake Victoria, and it actually peters out at the foot of one of these graben faults, part of the rifting in these old bauble swamps, and the sand dunes, shifting sands, is just here on the map. And the key is that the gorge is exposed. The rocks in brown, which are known as the Olduvai beds 1 to 7, as they were mapped many years ago, using some relatively old terminology. And then the volcanic ash from Olduvai Gorge, the calcareous volcanic ash, is the light green. That's the covering which the wildebeest are moving to for the short grass plains. But if it wasn't for the river, these Olduvai beds wouldn't be exposed. And the age of I'll show you that in a minute. This is just a view of the gorge from the visitors center. You have beds 1 and 2 in the bottom of the gorge, which is where the fossils are. Bed 3 is a red sandstone, windblown sandstone. That doesn't have fossils. And then by taking a regional picture, what's quite nice is it shows you that we're not too far from Ngorongoro. This is the Ngorongoro volcano here, the caldera just over the top of the rim, of course, and that's the Olmoti volcano. And they play a key role. So if we looked at the stratigraphy of the bed, the ages, I've cut the slide off a bit, unfortunately, but the ages are in millions of years. So the main fossils the really key ones were in bed 1 and a little bit bed 2. So they have an age of between 2 million and 1.8 million, which is Pliocene. And and then into the Pleistocene, younger than 1.8 million. And the green that's volcanic lava from Ngorongoro, and you're not going to preserve fossils in the lava, obviously. So the oldest fossils that you would find here would be 2 million. But within the beds, if we look at a close-up of bed 1, now we have all of these very accurate isotopic age, radiometric age dates. And the key fossils, OH7 and OH5, they came from different localities in the gorge, but they actually have the same age, 1.845. And these magenta strips, they're basically volcanic ash from Ngorongoro or Almaty. So in fact, the older ones are in Ngorongoro, and then I think by the marker tuff, which goes into bed 2, that is now the Almaty volcano. And many of the fossils are preserved in the volcanic ash. And Mary Leakey, the wife of Louis Leakey, who obviously instigated the whole programs, but Mary made the big discoveries. She wrote in one of her books that when they made the discoveries back in the 60s, if radiometric dating as a technique wasn't available and were accepted, they would never have got these ages accepted in the international community, because at the time a lot of people thought hominins could not be more than 10 or 20,000 years old. So to get an age of 1.845 million accepted was obviously quite a big part of their research, and this is really what put Olduvai on the map. Of course, there's many other discoveries around the world now, but this is where the really pioneering discoveries were first made. And if we looked at the geology, from the cliff, you see an ignimbrite is a fancy type of lava that's simply related to the caldera eruption of Ngorongoro. So you can see how the geology all sort of links in. 2 million years old, so there won't be fossils older than that. The marker tuff, that's that volcanic ash layer that separates bed 1 and bed 2. You can see it quite easily, but most of the key fossils were in bed 1, sort of in the sort of situation here. And there were not fossils in bed 3, the windblown sandstone. And this is our group actually the picture in 95. I've been there quite a few times recently, but I quite prefer the older picture. This is the actual discovery site, and this is a fantastic Tanzanian anthropologist who took us around and has taken me around on a few subsequent trips, showing us a replica of the skull, which was labeled as OH5. The fancy name, I've struggled to pronounce it, I'm afraid, Zinjanthropus bolsai. Bolsai was the American sponsor. It's also been renamed one of the Australopithecus, but then it gets renamed back again. But the general name was OH5, was Nutcracker Man. And this is the cranium that was excavated from that particular site. But the mandible actually came from a site near Lake Natron. But if you looked at the rock face, you can actually see these volcanic ash layers. They're very prominent in the cliff faces. So the sediments have deposited in a basin which is related to the rifting, the stretching of the continent, and then a lot of the fossils have been preserved in the volcanic ash. So the whole rift system plays a key role in all of these processes and preserving the fossils. And then the other fossil found by Mary Leakey, it was about a couple of 100 meters sort of down the gorge from this picture. OH7 was nicknamed Handyman, Homo habilis. And they both had similar ages. So that's the talk, and thank you very much for listening. And maybe I can encourage you to go and buy the book, just to support Strake, who put a lot of sort of upfront money to publish these books of all the photographs. It's not cheap, and I think they do the most fantastic job. So thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic, Roger. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. What an absolutely fascinating region, and so diverse, and to have got through that much in the time. We appreciate condensing and, making it so cool, and definitely piqued my interest. The geology is crazy. Could we ask anybody, if you've got questions, you could put them across into the Q&A box along. Roger, I was wondering, is there any evidence that the rifting and the volcanic activity is slowing down? Is it accelerating? Is it constant? Is there any evidence to support either way?
There is, and it's very complicated because people like to look at the compositions of the volcanic material, the magmas that come up, and there is a suggestion that the rifting is sort of moving into like a final stage because of compositional changes. But then other people might say, well, the seismic activity, would give you a different story. So I think these things are quite difficult to pin down. And of course, it's quite difficult to really get to grips of the long time periods that geologists talk about. So 35 million years to geologists seems quite recent, especially in South Africa, because we deal with rocks like the Bushveld complex 2 billion years, the Wits, where the gold is 2.7 billion, whatever. But of course, even a million years is an enormously long period of time. So you can imagine a few faults can happen. And before you know it, the process is up and running again. So the answer is it seems relatively quiescent, but I don't think one could say that.
Fair enough, thank you. David's asked, thanks, Roger. Please tell us why the water around the Arusha is so red. I think that was to do with the blooms.
I think that's more Lake Natron rather than Arusha. If that's because of the cyanobacteria in the water. So, as it blooms in the water, you get that reddish color. But I have got a paper that I dug out, which I can share with David on the high fluorine content of the water around Arusha. And that's because fluorine is an alkali, which is concentrated in the volcanic rocks. So
David's just followed up saying, what about the fluorite? So I think you're...
Yeah. So there's high fluorine, especially in those Mamela lakes, and I believe some of the villages around there have problems, health problems related to excessive fluorine in the water, And it's just there's very high concentrations in the rocks, and then it gets leached out by the waters and the springs, of course. Yeah.
So am I correct in saying, so the difference, the alkaline lakes are fresh waters that have become alkaline because of what's being leached out of the rocks. It's not alkaline water. Does it start as fresh water and it becomes alkaline because of the deposits or where it's sitting? Or what makes the difference between fresh water and the alkaline?
Yeah, no, I didn't cover that very well in the talk. I sort of I normally do but some of the lakes in Kenya give better examples. But essentially, the alkalinity is really dictated by the catchment. So in the rift in Kenya, there's maybe 7 lakes, of which maybe the most famous might be Lake Nakuru, where the flamingo congregate, and the pictures you might remember from the movie Out of Africa and that. So that's an alkaline lake. But then you go a bit further north and you'll have Lake Naivasha, also quite well known, but that's a freshwater lake. So what it is that the freshwater lakes have a relatively large catchment, so a lot of water is fed in. So it's fresh water being fed in, but the alkaline lakes have a smaller catchment, so only limited water, and then evaporation is simply greater than ingress. And because it's in the Rift Valley, none of the lakes, all of the lakes, they're trap basins. So
so then it just becomes, as it evaporates, just becomes more and more concentrated,
more alkaline. Yeah, and then obviously on top of that, there are an awful lot of dissolved salts, sodium and salts in the water. So you have a sort of source bed of sodium, if you like, and then they just get more and more alkaline. But in the rift, in the Albertine Rift, where it's quite a different type of rift because there's not much volcanic activity. It's more sedimentary basins. There you've got these huge, big freshwater lakes, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, and some of those do actually have rivers which exit. So each rift you have to take a little bit separately. Yeah.
Fair enough. David's asking, is the fluorite coming from the basalt?
From the volcanic rocks, from the volcanic lavas and ashes. Yeah.
Yeah. Got you. Yeah. Diane is saying, thank you so much, Roger, for a most excellent talk. Where would I find out more about these geotourism places? Are there anything specific that you can advise, or is it you were mentioning that it's starting? Is there anything
I think
specific?
it's just a concept which is sort of starting off, and I don't think there's any particular geo tours available.
Mhm.
But if you get the information maybe from the book and actually design something that you want to go and see,
Mhm.
my interaction with all the safari companies, all the ones I've dealt with, is they're hugely flexible, and they will sell you a package through the tour companies, and you go on like a fixed route, which is obviously quite boring. But if you actually design your own safari, which is what I've always done, and I've taken 2 or 3 quite big geological trips, like 20, 25 people, then of course geologists, you can't keep geologists in a vehicle, so they're always going to get out and misbehave. So then you have to organize this and make sure you've got rangers with their rifles all nicely lined up at the different places to keep the sheep under control, and you can organize it. So recently Amelia and I went off to a trip to the very north of Kenya, and I would say it was one of the best days I've had in the bush for a while. We just simply got the guide. We only did it on site, but we just got our guide with the vehicle to nab one of the rangers from the rangers post in the Shaba National Reserve, which is where Born 3, with Joy Adamson happened. And
Okay.
we went off to the total remote area where the whole day nobody goes, so you don't see a single vehicle. And then the guy, once he got used to us and realized I might be getting not as young as I was, but I'm still reasonably fit and I'm quite fast, so we could walk. And then if there's a elephant or a buffalo, you have to move a bit quickly. You need hikers up and down mountains and into the gorge, and there's a huge river there, sort of on the edge of the Shaba Reserve. So you can do these things. It's just a matter of planning and getting a little bit organized. Well,
there you go, Diane. A bit of homework, and everything's possible. She says that. Diane says, thank you so much. David's followed up saying, I always thought the fluorite to be white in nature. Is there not a lot of iron in the water? And then secondly, the water flowing around the Arusha National Park looks like rooibos tea. Not sure if you can comment on that.
yeah, there is. There's not a lot of iron in the rocks because they're alkaline basalts. So the iron concentrations will be relatively low. I think the water color, a lot of it will be the same as the what's the river at Nature's Valley, Brett? I bet you would know.
Kibums.
No, but it doesn't matter. Yeah, it's in the general area. But there's a lot of the rivers in the garden route. They also look like rooibos tea, don't they? It's the tannins in the water from the plant life. So if you have you need a combination of rivers which have got a very low sediment load, but they have high tannins from the vegetation. So I think that's what maybe causes the coloration.
Google tells me it's the salt river, the Salt River, Tsikama
Yeah,
Mountains.
no, it's not. It's the one next to the Salt River. Salt River, yeah.
Groot River, that's Groot
Yeah,
Brak.
it's
Anyway,
probably the Groot River. Yeah, Groot River.
there we
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. We'll get there in the end. Yeah.
Judy's also said she thinks it might be the salt. That's fantastic, Roger. That's just it's so much. I don't see any more questions here. I think it's just left to me to thank all of our guests for joining us, to invite us to join us for our next talk in June, and to thank you, Roger, again for sharing your knowledge, your passion and dedication, and look forward to possibly having you back when you have a new passion with something to share with us.
Thank you very much, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks to Belinda in the back. Thanks again to Straight
Yeah.
Nature.
Thanks, Belinda.
Thanks, everybody. Keep well. Bye-bye.